last day of the conference. Thank you for coming so early after the social yesterday. And today, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our last plenary, Professor Christine Caldwell. So she's a professor at the Division of Psychology, University of Stirling. And she did her PhD in St. Andrews, working on social learning in the human primates and humans. And she's an expert in cumulative culture, and today she's going to talk about the cognitive challenges in human cumulative cultural evolution. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me okay? Is the mic working all right? Excellent. All right, so first of all, just to start with a small apology. So my talk might be in danger of running a little short today. I know that's not normally the apology you get at the start of a talk. I think I was so worried about it being too long that I've perhaps been a little over-enthusiastic in the edit. It's in danger of being a little too short. So sorry, not sorry, you might get a slightly longer break. More importantly, though, yes, good morning, everyone. And the first thing that I wanted to say was a really big thank you to the conference organising committee, because it's been a really fantastic meeting. And I'm really pleased to get the opportunity to talk to you this morning about some of the work that's been going on in my lab over the past few years. And specifically, I'm going to talk to you today about human cumulative culture and some of the cognitive challenges that may arise in the kinds of learning contexts that result in cumulative cultural evolution. So it's working. Okay. Just to give you a very brief overview of the structure of this presentation. Sorry if the arrow keys and stuff weren't yeah, you just needed to wake up, a bit like me. Okay, so brief overview of the structure of the presentation. I'm going to start by explaining what I mean by cumulative cultural evolution and why this is considered to be a particularly interesting and important feature of human social learning, even though, as we'll see, it might not be completely unique to humans, depending on how strictly we define the concept. The main body of my talk, though, will consist of a review of some studies carried out by members of my lab, all targeted at understanding the kinds of cognitive challenges that may be involved in real-world cases of cumulative cultural evolution. I'm going to focus in particular on some of the experimental work that we've done with human children, and we have also carried out studies with adult humans and with non-human primates, and I'm probably going to mention some of that work along the way too. We do, of course, need the studies of adult human participants to find out what exactly adults' capabilities are and what they can do under certain circumstances. And we need the studies of non-human primates as well to kind of find the limits on their capacities in analogous tasks. But the studies of human children have often proved to be really critical in shedding light on the cognitive demands of cumulative cultural evolution. And that's because these have been able to demonstrate how the behaviours supporting it emerge and advance during development. So by comparing performance between children of different age groups, we can show how children's capacities change as they get older. And it can be particularly enlightening to see at what age something resembling adult-like competence seems to emerge, because this can give us some clues to the cognitive processes that might be involved. And in the studies that I'm going to present today, we find that children's developing metacognitive abilities might be particularly critical in supporting cumulative cultural evolution. And this applies to understanding one's own learning, which allows learners to fully exploit the social information that's potentially available to them. But it also applies to understanding others' learning, because this allows experienced individuals to pass on their knowledge in the most effective ways. Okay, so to start with this issue of why anyone is even interested in this phenomenon of cumulative cultural evolution, well, hopefully I'm preaching to the converted here, and certainly I've got the impression with many of the talks that I've been to that is the case, that most people are on board with the idea that this is an interesting concept, albeit my sample of this conference has been a slightly biased sample in the talks I've chosen to go to in the parallel sessions. But just in case anyone's in any doubt about why this is an interesting phenomenon, well, it's been identified as a kind of key difference between humans and other species. But not only that, this difference is believed to account for a wide variety of other distinctively human traits. And in fact, it's been highlighted in a number of recent high-profile accounts of human evolution as being fundamental to understanding human nature, including our extraordinary evolutionary success as a species. So cumulative cultural evolution is believed to give us this sort of huge adaptive advantage. And that's because it really is a pretty neat trick which allows us to benefit vicariously from the accumulated experience of many previous generations of learners. So it's a very useful shortcut to adaptive solutions, which would in many cases be prohibitively laborious to learn by trial and error. And just so that we're clear exactly what it is we're talking about, I've listed here Masudi and Thornton's core criteria for cumulative cultural evolution. These being, firstly, change in behaviour or product of behaviour, such as an artefact, typically due to asocial learning, followed by, secondly, the transfer via social learning of that novel or modified behaviour to other individuals or groups, where, thirdly, the learned behaviour causes an improvement in performance, which is a proxy of genetic and or cultural fitness, with, fourthly, the previous steps repeated in a manner that generates sequential improvement over time. So it creates this sort of iterative process, all of which has the effect of allowing later generations to benefit from the accumulated learning efforts of their predecessors. And this supports the development of complex adaptive behaviours and technologies that couldn't be invented by a single individual working alone, or in many cases even within a single generation of a population. But despite its obvious advantages and despite its apparent ubiquity in human populations, there is very little evidence of this phenomenon in any other species. But it's probably not completely absent either, at least if we're using this particular set of criteria as our definition. So, for example, Sasaki and Biro showed that the flight distances of homing pigeons became increasingly efficient over generations of social transmission in this very nice experimental study, which used transmission chain design. And similarly, Jesmer and colleagues found that translocated populations of bighorn sheep and moose gained knowledge about the seasonal distribution of forage and increased their propensity to migrate as a result over a period of multiple decades following their introduction to a novel habitat, so over sort of multiple replacement generations of other ungulates. So both of these examples provide nice illustrations of later learner generations being able to benefit from that accumulated experience of their predecessors. So we might take from this that there's perhaps nothing particularly cognitively challenging about cumulative cultural evolution after all, since it's possible to find it in these non-human species not even particularly noted for their exceptional cognitive abilities. I hope nobody's horribly offended on behalf of pigeons, sheep or moose to hear me say that. But in any case, I would argue that these particular examples both represent quite special cases in the sense that they don't require the kinds of metacognitive abilities that are in fact used in many cases of cumulative cultural evolution in humans. So we'll come back to those studies in a moment after I've told you about the first study that I want to talk about today. Before I go on to the details of that specific study, first of all I'd like to set the scene just to explain some of the sorts of experimental designs that we've used in previous work to demonstrate cumulative cultural evolution under laboratory conditions in adult human participants. So this slide illustrates one of the tasks that we've used in these studies. So participants are asked to build a tower from raw spaghetti and plasticine with the goal of making it as tall as possible, which is more challenging than you might think. Participants then complete this task in sequence, and they're organised into experimental learner generations so that they're able to learn from those immediately before them in the sequence. And what we find in these studies is that typically participants in the learner generations build towers that are taller than those built by participants earlier in the sequence. And that's despite the fact that everyone gets the same amount of time to complete the task and even the same amount of time to observe their predecessors. However, the value of that social information is increasing over generations, such that learning from, I can use the laser pointer, learning from this person would be more beneficial than learning from this person. So with this task and with other similar ones, we've been able to capture in the laboratory this sort of important feature of cumulative cultural evolution, that it allows us to benefit from this accumulated experience. But in the first study that I'll tell you about, we took a slightly different approach, and one that's described in this review paper. One of the problems of running studies involving transmission chains is that particularly if you want to compare between groups representing specific populations, for example, so children of different age groups, the required sample sizes rapidly become extremely large, because each transmission chain is really just one single replicate, an N of one, if you like, despite the fact that it involves multiple participants. And if you're seeking out populations of a specific group, such as children of a very particular age, they do become logistically quite complicated to run. But with the right sort of task, it becomes possible to run multiple trials with a single individual, rather than running a transmission chain comprising multiple different individuals. And you can take those trials, run with that single individual, to infer from that individual's data alone what the outcome of a transmission chain would be, and whether we would see this kind of positive relationship whereby some social information is more valuable and leads to better performance. But in this case, obviously, what we're doing is exposing the participant to demonstrations of varying success and looking to see whether their performance increases as a function of the success of that demonstration. We can't do that with a task like the Spaghetti Towers task that I told you about earlier, because what a participant learned in one trial would still be relevant for subsequent trials. So those sorts of carryover effects in a task like that would interfere with our attempts to manipulate something like demonstration success. But if we use a more abstract task, it's possible to have completely independent trials, or trials where at least the solution to one trial is completely independent from the solution to another. But ensure that it's still possible to quantify success in a fairly precise way that we can compare across trials. So we've now used the method illustrated on this slide in several different studies. And in this particular example, what's illustrated is one of these abstract types of tasks. So this is intended to represent a simple kind of search task where some squares of the grid are rewarded and some are unrewarded. The participant's task is to find as many rewarded squares as they can. In this particular example, the task involves making 4 selections on the grid, and it's possible to find a maximum of 4 rewarded squares, which are hidden in that grid somewhere. In this particular example, the green grid squares indicate the rewarded squares, and the red ones indicate the unrewarded squares. So with a task like that, the participant can be exposed to social information of varying quality depending on the score that the demonstration trial has obtained. And we can get information about how they respond to those different demonstration success trials. And essentially, the participant should always simply select the squares that were shown to be rewarded and should avoid those that were shown to be unrewarded. And if they always do that, then of course performance should improve over successive episodes of social transmission. But if there's no relationship between the success of the demonstration and the participant's own success in the task, then cumulative improvement would not be possible. So my PhD student, Charlotte Wilkes, who you can see here, she used a task exploiting this same logic with children aged between 3 and 7 years old to make it a bit more interesting for the children. Instead of it being a completely abstract task, she gave the task a pirate theme. So the children had the task of searching for treasure in these treasure chests that you can see here. So the rewards were always located in one of the 3 differently coloured treasure chests, and there were three rows each containing these 3 chests and 1 rewarded location in each row. The demonstrator was the parrot puppet that you can see to the left of the shot there. So the parrot always went first, played first, and then the children took their turn after seeing the parrot's attempt at the task. So this setup allowed us to present children with 3 trials of varying success, each one using a different set of coloured boxes, as you can see illustrated here. And of course, what we were looking for in children's performance was something a bit like this. So a positive relationship between the success of the demonstration and the child's own success when it was their turn to make the selections. And in one of our conditions, we found some quite striking age differences in children's performance. So this plot shows the children's mean raw success scores, so their score out of 3 for the trials where either 1, 2, or all 3 of the rewarded locations had been found during the demonstration. The red line indicates chance level performance, so that's what we would expect children to do if they were just ignoring the social information altogether and selecting at random. At ages 3 and 4, scores following all demonstration types, so whether 1, 2 or 3 rewarded locations had been found, they were above that chance level performance. So some social information was being used. It wasn't that they were just ignoring it completely. But the scores following the higher success demonstrations, so when either 2 or 3 of the rewarded locations had been found during the demonstration, they weren't significantly higher than what the children were getting when only 1 of the 3 rewarded locations had been revealed. So they were scoring above chance overall, but not scoring more highly following more successful demonstrations. So this couldn't result in cumulative improvement over multiple episodes of social transmission, even though some social learning was going on, because they didn't seem to be able to get the added value of the potentially more beneficial information. But in the slightly older children, so age 5 and 6, we started to see something a bit different. So performance was again above chance overall, and scores were higher following the highest success demonstrations than following the lowest success demonstrations. So there was some evidence that children were scoring more highly in response to more successful demonstrations. So there was some signs of the potential for cumulative improvement as a result of transmission in these older children. But I think this becomes more interesting in the context of the performance that we saw in another condition of this task. So we actually ran 2 conditions in the end with this task. One in which the social information remained visible during the child's own attempt, and another, and that's the results that I've just shown you, where the information was concealed again before the child began their own attempt at the task. So you can see an example at the top here of what the task stimuli look like in this visible condition, where the information was kind of left on display following the demonstration, if you like. So the child could still see not only which of the chests had been opened, but also whether that had been a rewarded or unrewarded location. So in the red and yellow chests that you see there, they were marked as unrewarded locations. We marked unrewarded locations with scrunched up newspaper, which turned out to be just about the only thing that children found boring enough not to want to look for it in a treasure chest, because pretty much everything we thought of they wanted to find, not scrunched up newspaper as it turned out. So those ones were unrewarded locations. The one with the coloured tissue paper in the blue treasure chest, that marked a rewarded location. So the reward was hidden in there along with the coloured tissue paper. So all of that information essentially remained on display. And that contrasted it with the condition that I've just shown you the results of, where after the parrot took its turn, all of these treasure chests were closed and the child had to sort of retain the information themselves in memory. Now, in the condition where the information remained visible, perhaps unsurprisingly, we can see that children of all ages managed to outperform the demonstrations by scoring higher on average in both the lowest success demonstrations and the higher sort of 2 out of 3 demonstrations. So in all age groups, the social information was being used almost optimally in order to actually outperform the demonstrator on most trials. So these patterns of performance could definitely result in cumulative improvement over successive episodes of transmission. So coming back to the animal examples that I mentioned earlier, I think there's an important link between the performance of the children in this much easier version of the task and what's happening in these cases. So in both of these examples, the social information kind of comes for free, if you like, as an incidental outcome of the herding or flocking tendencies of the species. So the naive individuals don't need to kind of actively direct their learning to acquire the beneficial trait. But in contrast, what we think is happening in our task with the children is that when the information needed to be retained, especially for the more successful demonstrations in which there was more to be retained, this required a certain amount of cognitive effort, and so success was probably supported by metacognitive strategies that simply weren't available to the younger children. And obviously this appeared to develop relatively late, so that ability to benefit from the higher quality information perhaps may have arisen from strategies that were ones that were themselves actually learned as a result of social experience, perhaps through formal schooling, or at the very least involving language skills that could be put to work involved in strategies such as mental rehearsal, for example. So we think that illustrates a sort of really nice way in which metacognitive abilities are probably required in a lot of real-world cases of cultural evolution, in the sense that almost by definition, the things we're trying to learn in kind of real cases of cumulative cultural evolution are almost by definition really quite difficult and complex, so probably need a certain amount of cognitive effort to learn them, as opposed to just accessing the social information. However, the importance of being able to direct your own learning is possibly even more relevant in situations where that information, that social information itself, does need to be sought out rather than being kind of presented to us on a plate. In a lot of kind of typical paradigms on social learning, experiments on social learning, particularly in studies of children, the sort of standard paradigm involves a participant being presented with a demonstration, and then the question is whether the participant learns from that demonstration, and if so, how much, what bits. But in the next study that I want to talk about, we wanted to kind of slightly turn that on its head to ask, okay, so you know you have something that you want to learn, there's something that you need to know, how hard is it to figure out what is going to be the best demonstration, what's the right demonstration to watch to get that information? And this work was carried out by another former PhD student, Kirsten Blakey, and she presented children aged between 3 and 8 years old with a task like the one that you can see on this slide here. The box contains a reward, but it's locked with a padlock, and the padlock can be opened with one of the 2 keys. So Kirsten would start by establishing the children understood the task and were motivated to get the reward, and once that was established, She would then present them with the real experimental trials, which also involved posing the children with a question of which of these potential video clips they would want to watch to help them solve the task, make the right choice of key to open the padlock and access the reward. Now, superficially, this task is actually pretty trivial because all the participant has to do is pick the still image that shows the same box and the same set of keys as the ones that are right in front of the child at that point in time. And that means that they get to watch that video. At which point they see the demonstrator either choose the correct key and successfully open the padlock and access the reward, or choose the incorrect key and fail to open the padlock and not get the reward. Either way, it should be possible to work out the correct choice from watching the video as long as they have chosen the correct demonstration video. And as you can see from this slide, we also manipulated demonstrator characteristics, specifically age and gender. The reason for this was because we were actually interested to see that if participants were incorrect and if they weren't choosing the correct target video, was it because they were defaulting to using other strategies incorrectly in this context, such as model-based biases. So those features were always counterbalanced in relation to what was actually the correct target video in the context of our task. I wanted to mention it because it's a sort of obvious feature of our design, but as I say, it doesn't impact on the results because it was always counterbalanced, and as it turned out, didn't turn out to be hugely influential on children's choices anyway. So, as I said, in many ways this should be quite an easy task, and actually we expected that children would probably perform pretty well, and that's why we tested children as young as 3 years old. But in fact what we found was that it was really only our very oldest groups that were performing anywhere close to ceiling on this task. The other age groups were above chance, because that would be 25% overall, because they had to choose one out of the 4 videos. But they were still wrong about as often as they were right, suggesting they hadn't really understood the task in quite the same way as the 7 and 8-year-olds. So we think that this sort of slightly above chance performance in the younger children was probably just created by the children having something of a bias to choose the demonstrator that had the apparatus that matched their own, but without really appreciating the information value that was bringing. And that interpretation was somewhat reinforced when we looked to see what the children actually did when they got the correct information. So if they were choosing the correct video because they did fully appreciate the potential information value, then we would expect that once they got to see that video, the information should be used in the appropriate way, and the children should be successful. And of course, in all age groups, there were a reasonable number of correct choices made, albeit sometimes that was probably just by chance. But that meant that it was possible for us to analyse that data of, okay, well, when that correct choice was made, how well was the information in the video used? So in principle, what the children should be doing is, if they saw the correct choice, they should be copying the choice of key, and if they saw an unsuccessful demonstration and the wrong choice of key, then they should be choosing the other one. But again, it was really only in the older children where the information was being used really effectively. So 3-year-olds were essentially at chance, and 4 and 5-year-olds were above chance, but they were still well below ceiling, especially on trials where the demonstrator had been unsuccessful. And we think that study demonstrates quite nicely some of the kinds of cognitive challenges that, again, might be implicated in a lot of real-world cases of cumulative cultural evolution that have been not considered that much in a lot of the previous literature. So a lot of the time when there's a specific skill that we want to learn, or we're faced with a particular problem that we need a solution to, then in many cases we have to identify who possesses the relevant knowledge and perhaps go out of our way to ensure we get an opportunity to learn from that individual. And this probably involves some quite complex metacognitive thinking. First of all, to understand that someone else might know what you don't, and then to work out who that is likely to be, and then to think about how to potentially access that expertise, whether simply by being in the right place at the right time or requesting instruction, for example. So in many cases, the biggest challenge of all might simply be getting to that point of having access to the information that we need, as opposed to what we actually do with it once we get it. So those first two studies that we've looked at show that from a learner's perspective, they may often need to be able to direct their learning towards information that can help them fulfill a goal, sometimes take steps to ensure retention of potentially relevant information. But metacognitive understanding is probably even more critical for potential teachers, so experienced individuals who could, in principle, communicate useful information to naive individuals. And this final study that I want to tell you about was carried out by another former PhD student, Gemma McIntosh, and we've actually only fairly recently submitted it for publication, so this one actually isn't out yet. Now, it's not a new idea to suggest that distinctively human teaching might be a key part of the explanation for uniquely human cumulative cultural evolution. But to date, there's actually been very little in the way of direct evidence that links differences in cognitive capacity, so differences between populations, known differences in cognitive abilities, for example, with differences in social transmission behaviour that demonstrably impact on the accumulation of cultural information. And that's what we were attempting to do in this study. So in this particular study, we directly compared conditions which differed only in terms of whether the transmitted information had been intentionally shared or was acquired incidentally from another's activity. As this is kind of a key difference between a lot of examples of social transmission in humans and many, not all, examples of social learning in animals. And we wanted to try and make it as fair a comparison as possible by ensuring that the quantity of information transmitted in both cases was equivalent. This is something that isn't normally controlled in studies looking at effects of teaching on cumulative cultural evolution, including studies carried out by myself in that, whereby although you might find a difference in a teaching condition compared with the other control or comparison conditions, you don't know whether the participants in the teaching condition simply had more information than participants in the other condition, and that's why they were doing better, rather than that information being sort of qualitatively better, if you like. And that's kind of what we wanted to look at here. And we also wanted to know, of course, once again, what the age effects were and what the developmental trajectory of any sort of expertise in this regard looked like. So really what we were testing was the hypothesis that when transmission occurred through a learning bottleneck, that intentional knowledge sharing would allow for greater accumulation of beneficial information compared to inadvertent social information. And that would be due to the potential for highlighting information likely to hold the greatest value for the learner. We went on to investigate this in children of a range of ages as well as adults. So we were basically taking this premise that there's always going to be some constraint on what can be learned, whether it's just time constraint or a resource constraint or whatever. There's always limits. Can you get the most value out of those constraints by having intentional information sharing as opposed to just a sort of random snapshot of another person's behaviour? So in this study, we were actually back to using a sort of traditional transmission chain design. We did need a lot of participants for this study. I think it was worth it, though. Each chain was assigned to one of 3 different experimental conditions. All participants were completing the same grid search task, so this task is not so different from the sort of example that I showed you earlier. The goal of this task was to find 3 green targets arranged in a 3x3 square like this one. We sort of loosely based this task on the game of battleships, so it would be something kind of familiar and fun for participants. So the idea was they kind of had to find these hidden ships, which were the sort of 3x3 squares, of which there were 3 located within the search space, sort of find them and sync them, so to speak. And in the full information condition, participants were shown the entire search outcome that had been obtained by their predecessor in the chain. So they got all the information, everything that the participant had found, and whether it was rewarded or unrewarded before they took their turn. In the intentional information condition, participants were asked to select a subset of their search outcomes. So they were asked to select just 3 grid squares from their own search outcome to pass on to their successor. And in the inadvertent information condition, so we matched the amount of information. So again, it was an equivalent subset, just 3 grid squares that were passed on to the next participant. They were randomly selected from the search outcome of the predecessor, but they were just selected by the computer program on which the task was running. So this was supposed to be equivalent to just getting this sort of random snapshot of another individual's behaviour that's kind of unbiased in any way by sort of anyone's opinions about its informativeness. And our sort of key measures that we use to evaluate performance on the task were both the overall task score and the number of search attempts used up by missing targets, by finding unrewarded locations. And we pre-registered both of those as our sort of key task performance measures. And using both these different task performance measures, we found that in the adults, performance improved with chain position, as we would expect, with the sort of information accumulating in the chain, consistent with some sort of cumulative cultural evolution going on. But most importantly, we found that performance was better in the intentional condition compared with the inadvertent condition, despite the amount of information being the same. And interestingly, there was actually no significant difference between the intentional condition and the full information condition, despite the fact that the participants received a lot more information in that full information condition. In the children, the sort of middle group, which was our 7 to 8-year-olds that you can see in this middle row here, that's their data. This group was clearly task competent because we could see that they performed demonstrably better in the full information condition compared to the other 2 conditions. So they were able to respond to getting more information about the task, and they were able to make use of that. So they performed better in that full information condition compared with the other 2 on according to both of the task measures. So it's not that they were completely oblivious to social information, they were using it, and more information was better. But there was no difference in that group between the intentional and the inadvertent conditions. In contrast, the oldest group, so the 9 and 10-year-olds, they showed essentially exactly the same pattern as the adults. So they performed better in the intentional condition compared with the inadvertent condition. And again, there was actually no significant difference between the full and intentional conditions in that older group of children. So, how were the participants in the intentional condition managing to make the information that they passed on as valuable to the recipient as their entire search history would have been? Well, one of the things that we found our adult participants were doing was they showed a strong preference for revealing the location of the centre of targets. So I mentioned that participants were searching for these sort of 3x3 targets in the grid. So the adults particularly like to send that central location as part of their information to the next participant. So this graph here shows the proportion of target centres that were sent from targets that had been fully revealed during the search. So we only performed this analysis where the participant had revealed all 9 squares of the target. When that was the case, then we asked, okay, so how often were each of those locations selected as part of the transmission to the participant, and how often were they ignored and not sent. And so here you can see that the proportion of target centres that were sent was much higher than the other locations in the target, which are shown for comparison. Also shown for comparison are the sort of equivalent results for the two other conditions. Obviously, in the full information condition, all locations were always sent because the full outcome of the search was sent. And in the inadvertent condition, because the selections for what formed the transmission were just made at random by the computer, then of course the locations were sent in equal proportions. And so we knew that adults had this really strong bias, and that was likely to be kind of really particularly informative to the recipients. When we looked at the data from the children, what we found was that all of our age groups did show some bias for sending this central segment of a target, but the extent of the bias increased with age. So the oldest children did this somewhat less than the adults, but they did it significantly more than the two younger groups. So we believe that the ability to anticipate the needs of a learner drove these kinds of strategic transmission decisions, and that this accounted for the performance advantages that were seen in the intentional condition for the adults and the oldest children. And once again, this ability seemed to develop remarkably late. So in this case, not until children were kind of 9 and 10 years old. And that late development certainly seems consistent with the idea that cultural transmission may often implicate some quite advanced cognitive capacities, which are probably unlikely to be available to other species, and which may well be quite heavily experience dependent. So, to conclude, our studies with human children have led us to conclude that there may not be anything inherently cognitively demanding about cumulative cultural evolution in itself. And this is, of course, consistent with evidence showing that it is possible to elicit this phenomenon in non-humans, and even to observe this in their natural behaviours under the right conditions. And so instead, the challenges associated with many real-world examples of cumulative cultural evolution in humans probably arise from the fact that these involve, almost by definition, things that are quite difficult to learn. And this creates demands that require us as learners to direct our attention and to engage retention strategies, and as teachers to consider others' perspectives. Final conclusion is a little bit more speculative, but does possibly follow from our findings that advances in sort of fairly general purpose cognitive processes and broader socio-cognitive understanding seem likely to underpin successful performance on some of our tasks, and also that this occurs relatively late during development. And these findings have led us to conclude that distinctively human propensities for cumulative cultural evolution probably are explained by distinctively human cognitive processes, but it's unlikely that those cognitive abilities exist sort of purely for that purpose, and it's likely that they themselves are in large part heavily experience dependent rather than being a sort of very hardwired feature of our biology. Okay, finally, just want to thank all of my recent lab members listed here, all of whom have contributed to the work that I've presented today. Thanks also to the ERC grant that funded all of us, and thank you very much to all of you for listening.